Well, good morning, everyone. Morning. It's a joy to be with you all this morning. As you heard, my name is Reverend Tamara Boynton, and I work with the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado. And I just want to begin this conversation by expressing gratitude for the partnership that Interfaith Alliance of Colorado has had with Hill Congregational Church for so many years, and for the great work that we have done together for justice in our state. Joy to be with you, and I just want to know if any of you have heard that story, or if that story of Hannah and Peninnah sound familiar to you. A couple of you might have heard it. If that particular one didn't sound familiar, you might have remembered some other versions of it in the scriptures, versions of infertility of the beloved wife set against the fertility of the second wife, who then is able to go on and have children, but then the first wife miraculously ends up getting pregnant and having a child that can then continue the lineage. In some instances, the first wife has selected the second as a kind of surrogate, and in other instances, the second wife is the first wife's slave, and in some cases, the wives are sisters. It's all very complicated, but in this particular case, it seems that Hannah and Peninnah are kind of from the same station, and that they've been selected to fulfill the charge to the Israelites, which is to be fruitful and multiply. So, although we know that it certainly takes two to tango, the weight, if you will, of being fruitful and multiplying throughout history has fallen primarily on the bodies of the women. And the standing of women, or perhaps I should say people who can get pregnant in that patriarchal society, was directly proportional to their ability to bear children, and particularly sons. So women were married at the age of puberty, and sometimes betrothed much before then. They spent much of their fertile years either pregnant or nursing. Men were married young sometimes too, but if that first marriage was unsuccessful, which is to say no offspring or no sons, then the men were able to take second wives, and often those were much younger than them. So I have to believe that in some cases love bloomed and there were beautiful marriages and relationships, but when we hear those stories and kind of look at that, we all kind of think, wow, interesting. But again, that's because there was a lot of pressure placed on procreation, and that pressure was placed on, of course, the ones who were bearing the children, and that must have created lots of instances of some discord and shame. So in this story, there's a few characters that I just want to call out and explore them, and we're going to explore them in sort of an individual way, but also a little bit of an archetypal way. So just a quick review. We have Hannah, the first wife, tried for 10 years to get pregnant, because that was the rule. You could try for 10 years, and if it didn't work, then your husband was allowed to take a second wife. So she tried for 10 years, and I also want to admit she was probably very young when she was married, so maybe it took a little while for things to get in rhythm and get for things to get, for her cycles to get consistent and such. But in any case, it took 10 years. She was not able to have children. Her husband loved her. It says that in the scriptures, and she's childless. She takes her concerns to God, who answers her prayer, and she eventually does go on and have children. Peninnah is the second wife. She comes into the picture after Elkanah and Hannah have already been together for 10 years, but Peninnah was fertile and begins having children right away. She actually has 12 children. So 12 children before Hannah has her first child. So this is a pretty long period of time. Maybe it's 12 years, but gosh, 12 children in 12 years does not sound good to me. Or maybe I shouldn't say good, that's not the right word. Just sounds like a lot. I only have 2 children, and that was good. But Peninnah is cruel to Hannah, of course, because she's got this power of being the one who is able to conceive, and so she mocks and provokes her. Then we have Elkanah, the husband. So he's married to Hannah for 22 years, Peninnah for 12. He's got these 12 kids. He loves Hannah, but he also doesn't seem to understand her pain about her infertility. Am I not worth 10 sons? Come on, aren't I enough? And in order to soothe her pain, he gives her extra portions of food. Go just have something to eat. I'm sure you'll feel better. But of course, she's sick with depression and longing and the fact that she's not whole in society in this way. And then we have Eli, who's that priest, who's sort of the judging priest who accuses her of being drunk. And so he can't see the pain right in front of his very eyes before him until Hannah teaches him to see. And I just want to call out, like, isn't that always the case, that like the people who are carrying the weight of the pain are also then called upon to teach the people around them about the pain that they're carrying? So we have this sort of system of people, and it seems like at first glance that it's this love triangle of how like a family treats each other, and it's all about, disappointment and procreation and all that, and the faith of the lowly and the response to God, it's all those things. But I'm suggesting today that it's about a little bit more than that it's a little bit of an archetypal story about systems of oppression and the way that we all play our roles in perpetuating those systems, and what happens when God breaks in. So I'm going to tell you a little story about a partner church of yours, Mountain View United Church. 4 years ago, Mountain View came to Interfaith Alliance and was and entered into what at that time was called our Congregation Land Campaign, and that was a way for our congregation to think about unused or underutilized land and using it for missional purposes. So they began a visioning process, exploring what to do with their land. They dreamed and they prayed and they strategized and they made a plan, and they held community meetings and they testified at zoning meetings and city councils, and they were met with some resistance along the way from people who said things like, we support affordable housing, but just not this one or this project, maybe just not right here. And then some of the people said things like, it's not safe for the people to be here, it's probably not a good idea, and what about the parking, and what about the busy road and the children, and there was some of those kinds of conversations. And then other testimony from other people spoke to the love of neighbor and this notion that, stable housing increases so many other health equity factors, and this church really feels a calling to do this. And so all of this stuff is happening over the span, as I said, of 4 years. And just last week, that 4-year journey came to a final moment, because there was the final vote for in the Aurora City Council to approve the project, the partner project with Mountain View and Habitat for Humanity. So very, very exciting. So we could take a moment and be like, woo, 4 years, it came through, praise God, right? A powerful example of community support and lots of conversation and organizing and education and all this kind of stuff. So at first glance, you'd say, now what does a housing project have to do with Hannah, right? Hannah and Peninnah. Well, here's what I'm going to suggest. Those supporting the plan are like Hannah in that they're responding to an injustice. They're seeking to birth something new. They're sad and forlorn by the way the current system is unfolding. And then maybe some of those people who were on the other side that needed to come around, that took some time, that didn't really understand, those were the ones that were more like Peninnah, right? Privileged, housed already perhaps, confused by how their liberation and joy are actually entwined with Hannah's liberation and joy, that the housed and the unhoused, we are all entwined with one another, and our liberations are entwined. Those who are silent, there were lots of people who didn't really say anything about that project. And in that moment, those are the ones who are kind of like Elkanah, right? Is the housing crisis really that bad? Why don't they just stay where they're supposed to, or where the shelters are, or isn't there some other way that we can solve this problem, and sort of sit on the sidelines? And then, of course, there are the Elis, which are the ones who look upon the suffering, and instead of seeing the humanity from it, they blame people for too much wine or too much drink or something, that they somehow deserve the status that they're in, and they impose shame. So suddenly we have like this situation that's like, wow, these characters fit into a variety of different scenarios in our lives in a sort of surprising way. And then into that combination of factors and characters, God enters and disrupts the systems that are so hard to shift. God enters, God changes hearts, God enters to open up possibilities where impasse seemed the only way. And through that whole process with Mountain View, there were so many moments that it felt like, oh, after all this, we're not going to be able to do it, And yet, miraculously, God stays in the mix and turns the corner. So I want to offer another example, and then I'm going to invite you all to just take a moment and think about an example in your lives, so you can start pondering that right now. But here's a second example. We can see these characters emerge whenever and wherever racism is on display. White supremacy culture does serve to pit people against each other and create the very inequities and mistrust and conflict that exists in Elkanah's home. Hannah's pain drives her to God. That is the source of her drive to go to God, is her pain. So she is the one who sees and experiences the whole of injustice, like of the societal injustice of the patriarchal system. She experiences it in her body and carries that weight in her body and is living under a system that tells her what criteria are needed for her to be worthy and whole. She's expected to be grateful to even have a place, even have a home, even though she's not able to conceive. And then she's dismissed and redirected and silenced when she reveals the true pain that she's enduring. Well, in a society that's reckoning with racism, the Peninnahs in our culture are those who are shaming and controlling, right, from a place of privilege. The ones who feel like they themselves need to hold on to their power. Those are the ones who we know are in pain. Peninnah is not the beloved wife, so she has some pain in her heart. And that pain is what drives some of her treatment of Hannah, right? But rather than address it and work on healing and opening her eyes to how that system, which she thinks she's benefiting from, is actually harming her too, she actively perpetuates that system. She can't see beyond her small slice of power into the liberation that's possible for her. She believes that cruelty to Hannah will reduce her own pain, and we know that hurting people hurt people, and that Peninnah is actually a perfect example of this, right? And then we have Elkanah, who represents all the well-meaning people who don't really do the hard work of understanding. They try to make it better with a little bit over here, a little extra support over there, and then deep down inside, they kind of wonder why we're making such a big deal about all of these things, right? And then we have the priest, who represents those whose first response is blame and judgment when they see the pain of an oppressive system in the tears of those laboring within it. And then into that whole system, that combination of factors and characters and systems, God enters, right? To disrupt those systems that are so hard to shift. God enters, God changes hearts, enters to open up the possibilities where the impasse or the status quo seem to be the only logical outcome. So you see, there's like lots of ways that this little story, which seems like a little family story in the Bible, actually can help us understand some of the systems and some of the ways that the characters are playing out in our lives. So I wonder if there are any justice areas in your lives where you can see some of these archetypes. So I want to just give you a quick minute to think about where you might be a Hannah or a Peninnah or an Elkanah or an Eli, some way where you need God to enter and disrupt. And I'm just going to give you, like 30 seconds to ponder that. And I'm not going to ask you to share, but I am curious if any of you came up with some. And if you did, you can put your hand up. If there were any systems or situations that you came up with, a couple of you maybe. Well, I invite you to explore it a little bit and explore some of the ways that you might need God to enter and disrupt those systems. So now you might think, okay, well, how lovely. Now we've got that all figured out. And now that we've clearly located, Hannah is the oppressed but the faithful, and Peninnah is the sort of cruel and taunting one, and Elk is the clueless masses who sort of perpetuate systems of oppression that they benefit from, and then Eli as that sort of judging voice. I want to return to the actual title of today's reflection, which is called Intersections. And unfortunately, things are not nearly as clear-cut as we would have them be, right? Hannah is not wholly oppressed. She is also the beloved wife, so she carries a power that Peninnah does not. Peninnah is not wholly evil. She flaunts her success and seems to be acting out in ways that I would suggest just a couple of therapy sessions would probably really, really help. Everything in the household. And both Hannah and Peninnah are oppressed by a culture that equates the value of a woman with the number of sons she can nurture in her womb and bring forward into life. So and then we look at Elkanah. I mean, even Elkanah is oppressed by this same system because he's socially required to take a second wife. He's required to have children. I mean, at the end of the day, he ends up with something like 17 children, which, I mean, maybe 18, actually. 18 children, which, I mean, that's quite a, who knows? Like, maybe he was really enjoying time with Hannah before they had kids, right? He clearly loved her. They probably went on trips and got to do all sorts of fun things, right? But again, he's oppressed also by the system that says these are the things that you have to do. This is what your responsibility is. Of course, he responds to Hannah's pain with generosity, giving her a double portion and support because, you know, when she declares later that Samuel will be given to God, his response to her is, if that's what you think is best, honey, then okay, you know? And that could be the best he can do in terms of, like, he's a good husband, right? A good and loving and supportive husband. And then, of course, we cannot forget that the same person who wept bitterly for years seeking to get pregnant and bear a child, then the first thing is to give that child away. So, like, what does that mean in the context of this larger system of, you know, is this the act of a faithful person or a desperate person or someone who kind of didn't really want to have kids anyway? I don't know, you know, it's complicated. It's all always complicated. And that's the point of this, is that there's crisscrossing and intersecting identities of Hannah and Peninnah and Elkanah and Eli, and all of those identities impact the decisions that they make, and even more so, they impact the options that they have. Each one of them is framed by certain options and certain parameters. And then, out of all that, we return to God. So when we think about this story, there's a part of this story where we think that maybe this lesson is just as much about turning to each other and learning about each other and supporting and helping each other within the family and then within, like, the whole family of God, as much as it is about turning to God, that we need to be better to each other and hear each other and empower each other and build communities that embody these values, even and especially when it requires dismantling systems that are broken. But the crazy punchline of this story is not that. The crazy punchline of the story is that Samuel is not just a miracle child. He actually is the one who inaugurates a new era in the history of Israel. Before Samuel is the judges period, the sort of judgeship era, and after Samuel is the monarchy, the kingship era. And so he's essentially the pivotal point. Like, he is the person that is the pivotal point that moves society from one way of being and births it into a different way of being. Now, we could debate whether the monarchic period was any more just and helpful than the judges period. That's not as much the point here, as much as it is that he represents a system shift. And that system shift is that transitional moment, and system change and system shift, and those pivotal moments are where God does God's best work. Because while we're all doing our Hannah and Peninnah and Elkanah and Eli stuff and trying to work ourselves out and trying to be stronger and trying to figure out how to help each other and how to transform our cultures, God is putting pieces in place. God is birthing prophets and priests, and God is shifting power and opening up wombs of possibility so that we ourselves might even have the strength to usher in a new era for our time. May it be so. Amen.